my name's Ruth. I work for the Iona community as the leader, and I'm based in the northwest of England. So I'm actually speaking on behalf of the Iona community, which is a Scottish-based community, but many of us, as we know, don't live in Scotland, and I'm one of those. It's very good to have all of you here. I'm particularly delighted to welcome Trevor here from the island of Ireland, and Sarah Hills here from the island of Lindisfarne, the holy island of Lindisfarne. And shortly, Trevor and Sarah will be joining me. But I'm going to do some broad introductions just now. So I'm going to let you go back to your seats and unspotlight you for now. And when we have the conversation, we'll bring you back up again. So the broad introduction is just to say that this series of sessions began after an invitation by Deanne Speed, who's here on the call, and others from the Wellspring community in Australia to come and join them in a pilgrimage for highlighting the creation catastrophe that is around us. So we're going on a creation care pilgrimage for about 5 weeks in our autumn. And they invited me to come and join them in that pilgrimage as a Celtic Christian leader, which I was utterly delighted to do. And that invitation got me thinking, what do I think of when I think of the notion of being a Celtic Christian leader? And I guess, if I'm honest, if I was asked to introduce myself, I would say, like I did this evening, I'm the leader of a community, a religious community based in Scotland. I probably wouldn't typically use the word Celtic. I would usually talk about it being a Christian community. And I wondered, why do I not always embrace that word Celtic? And I guess I realized after the invitation arrived that I often have hesitancies about using the word Celtic, because it can lead, not always, but it can lead to notions of romanticism, about a glorious Celtic past. And if we're not careful, we can make assumptions about what we mean when we use that notion. It can imply some kind of direct link to a fully formed spirituality from a golden age. And it can also, if I'm honest, sometimes it can divert us as Christians living in community in the 21st century. It can divert us from the very real needs in our world, the real hard work today for justice for the poor, for justice for the people of Palestine, for working for the rights of refugees and migrants in our world, for working to uphold the notions of creation care fully, for deepening our contemplative lives. Now, we know that there are many ways that we can draw on our different heritages to enhance all of these areas. But I realized I was a little bit skeptical of that notion. So I took the invitation to dig deep, hence this series. And I was delighted that John Bell joined us for the first one and today, and that was looking at the notion of belonging and identity. And this evening, Sarah and Trevor and I will have a conversation about land, and then we'll throw the door open to yourselves to have time in breakout rooms for about 20 minutes with about 4 or 5 of you to explore some of those questions amongst yourselves. And then we'll come back and we'll finish off the time together with a more open conversation. And in that period, if you have a question, we'll ask you to put it in the chat, or if you have a comment, put it in the chat. And if you would like to come up to the front, so to speak, and join Sarah and Trevor and myself and join us in a conversation, then we'll spotlight you and bring you forward. So that's the flow of the evening. Let me just make sure I've got all my introductions covered. And what I'll say at the end is I'll remind us all of the next element in the series. It will be on the 12th of September with Ian Bradley, a Celtic scholar and speaker on all things to do with Celtic spirituality. And in that session, he will talk about what do we believe, or he'll respond to that question, what do we believe? So the first session with John Bell was, where do I belong? How do I belong under this banner of Celtic Christianity? This one is about where do I belong in terms of land and identity. And the third one will be about what we believe. I think that is all. The other 2 people to introduce to you are Rolf Billis and Fiona McDougall, 2 of our Iona community colleagues who are doing the technical support. So I'm very grateful to Rolf and to Fiona for being here and doing that. So before we do go into the conversation, just a short time to still ourselves, find yourselves in a comfortable position, a short time of quiet, and then I'll offer a prayer written by a dear friend of the Iona community and past member, Kate McElhaga, who wrote remarkable prayers. And this one that I'll share with you draws on some of our Celtic rhythms of prayer. So let's pray. Ever-present shield, your canopy of stars covers us. We sense your encompassing presence in the thrill of beauty, in the urgent claims of the poor, and deep within our hearts. The poverty of our response, O God of the living, brings us to our knees. Christ, our friend, we see your face in a crowded street. We sense your presence in a generous action, the costly offering, in the sharing of a cloak and the pouring of wine. Spirit of comfort, we search for you in the wakeful dead of night, in the surge of bitter loneliness, in the pain of death's betrayal, and in the smoking fires of nations at war. Shield and friend and comforter, encompass us with your presence. Go before us, go beside us, move within us and around us. Be present, Trinity of Peace, until our journey is ended and we see you face to face. Amen. So I'd like to invite Trevor and Sarah now to join me up at the front, and Fiona's going to spotlight you and bring you forward. And we have 3 questions to share. Dear friends, it's so good to be here with you. Before I go into the questions, just a very quick word from each of you just to say hello and where you're sitting. Trevor, do you want to say hi and where you are and say who you are?
Sure, yes. Well, hello, it's great to be with you all. Trevor's my name. And I'm actually in sort of the northeast of the island of Ireland. There's a nice place where the mountains of Mourne sweep down to the sea at Newcastle, and I'm just 3 miles of a little village north of that. Takes me 5 minutes to walk to the seaside, and with the majestic Mourne Mountains in the background. So I'm really blessed to be here, and I'm retired. Retired in 2014. Prior to that, my last job, if you like, was as a bishop of that part of Ireland in the southwest of Ireland, so involved, including all of County Kerry, County Limerick, and County Clare. So a very beautiful part of Ireland. And in a sense, that's where I suppose I came closest to things Celtic, but a little bit of that later.
Wonderful. I thought you were going to burst into song there about the mountains of Mourne going down to the sea. Maybe for another time.
I think maybe another time will be much better.
I would love that. Sarah, welcome. Just a brief word of introduction and then we'll kick off with the questions.
Thanks so much, Ruth. And it's really, really lovely to be with you all this evening. I've been looking forward to this evening. I'm sitting on the holy island of Lindisfarne. I've been here for about 4.5 years as the vicar of St Mary's Church on Lindisfarne. There's a board in the church, you may have seen it if you've been, which starts with the vicars of Holy Island in 635 AD with St Aidan and ends with me. So I feel very, very humble sitting in this particular place, in this particular seat, trying to follow in the significant footsteps of the Northern and maybe Celtic saints. We'll come back to that. So, and it's lovely to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much. And I hope you'll say more about each of you, about your backgrounds, also in the work of reconciliation and so on, as we go through the questions. We have 3 questions. We'll take about 25 minutes or so to get through these, and we'll each respond briefly to those, or fully also. And then we'll, like I said, we'll go into breakout rooms. And the first question, and I guess we've each described where we're sitting, and we are all sitting on an island of some kind. The island of Britain is an island, of course, and the Iona community has our kind of iconic home on the island of Iona. Scottish islands and islands all around this wider collection of islands. I'm thinking of Bardsey, I'm thinking of Holy Island, I'm thinking of the Aran Islands off the west coast of Ireland. Many of these islands are called thin places. And I suppose the question is, what does that mean for us today? I think it was George MacLeod, but he probably stole this from somebody else, who evoked the sense of a thin place where, in his words, the veil between things material and things spiritual is as thin as gossamer. So I'd like us to just talk a little bit more about that notion of what it means to be a thin place, drawing on whatever we mean by the Celtic tradition. And in so doing, maybe introduce yourself a little bit more about the island on which you are finding yourself at the moment, and what it is about that place that is particularly special. Having offered you that question, just to kick things off, I'll offer my own reflections on that question briefly, and then I'll pass over to you, Trevor, and then to Sarah. And as you've heard me say already, I'm not sitting on Iona, but I'm here in Cumbria. But I've also just today arrived back from the Glastonbury Festival, where the Iona community has a presence. And it's reminded me of when I was a child on Iona in the 1970s. There was a lot of people came to Iona looking for at the time ley lines and asking themselves, what does it mean to be a spiritual place? They would come from Glastonbury Tor and they would talk about this abbey in Glastonbury or near Glastonbury, which had some special quality to it. And so as a child of the 70s on Iona, I was very conscious that people pilgrimed to that island, looking for something very particular and very special. Ever since then, and this will not be news to any of you here, I'm sure, it has troubled me that, do we have to go to an island like Iona? Do we have to go to a special place like Glastonbury Tor in order to feel that deep sense of connection? Clearly, the answer is no. We can have a deep sense of connection where the liminal reveals itself to us. And I think, and again, this is not rocket science, that it's in the quality of our relationships that we feel that sense of deep connection. Nevertheless, the actual stunning beauty of an island like Iona, the length of time it takes for most people to travel to an island like Iona, gives a sense, it increases that liminality, I think. Now, remoteness is a very relative term. A place is only remote if you're not there. For those who are there, it's not remote. So again, I want to question, what do we mean by a remote liminal space on the edges of the world? Iona, when Columba arrived in 563 from Ireland, was right at the heart of the equivalent of our motorway system, because the way that the monks traveled was by sea. So it was anything but remote in that sense. So I have a lot of questions about this notion of thinness. Nevertheless, there is something that happens when we gather together and open our deep vulnerabilities to the compassion of the other and our herd. And just in ending, Glastonbury reminded me of that. In amongst 200,000 people with thrumming bass music in our ears, we were able to recreate a sense of liminality in a muddy field, because we were engaging in a deep, connecting conversation about the stuff of life, the thing that mattered. So I guess I'll just pause there and Trevor, ask you to respond to that question about the island on which you sit and the thinness or otherwise of it.
Yeah. As Ruth knows, I expressed some hesitation about entering this conversation at all, because I felt, in a way, I would be a bit of a fraud taking part. But she encouraged me to take part anyway, and thank you for that, Ruth. And the reason I say that is because I think, as you know, on the island of Ireland, what matters most is whether you're Catholic or Protestant. And for Catholics, and they have a deep sense of rootedness and, if you like, go back in terms of the tradition. And to be Protestant means not to be Catholic. I think part of that experience has been that the kind of spirituality that we have developed as a Protestant community here is very much not related to material things, but actually related to spiritual things. Very much in terms of the themes of the Reformation. You know, what matters, what was the spiritual, and not so much. And to be thinking about elements of the, if you like, Celtic spirituality, which in Ireland has got to do with pilgrimage to special places and holy wells and that sort of thing, and the tradition that Patrick, when he, if you like, taught people about following Jesus, he also incorporated many of their own traditions coming from, if you like, the more pagan past, and sort of melded that together. And as a good Protestant of the Reformation, it was to cut all of that out, you know. And I just realized now that in my own experience and in my own upbringing, how I've been deprived, if you like, of that necessity I think that we all have as human beings to earth our experience quite literally in our context and in our place and in the material that is around us. I had a very profound experience for me. One of the remotest symbols of living on the edge or of a thin place in Ireland is the island of Skellig Michael off the coast of Kerry. It's about 8 miles out into the Atlantic, and this is basically a rock. And in the tradition of, I suppose, the Desert Fathers, monks in the 7th century went to this rock in the middle of the seas and set up a community and a small community and a monastery there, which is incredibly well preserved, even to today. They made beehive huts, if you like, out of stone that they found on the rock. And they're perfectly preserved from, you know, the 7th century, quite remarkable. And that was in my diocese, and I said, this would be great. I'd love to, you know, make a pilgrimage to Skellig Michael and so on. And during my time as a bishop there, I never had time to go there. So before I left, I was determined to make an effort. Went down to see if I can get a boat across with my wife Joyce. No, sorry, it's too rough today. I had 1 day left, and I said, come down to the quay tomorrow and we'll see if we can make the journey. And I went across to the island, and this was literally in the week that I was to leave and retire, and had this beautiful journey out on very rough seas. Clambered up the thing and went up the 600 steps, climbing up the 230 meters to the top where the beehives were, and saw, you know, had a real sense of this community there. You could see where they lived, and you could see the little oratory they had, and the place and the little patch of ground where they grew their vegetables, and you could see where another place where they were made steps down so they could actually fish. It's really a very precipitous kind of rocks that's standing up in the middle of the ocean. And honestly, the experience really was amazing. That connection with people in the 7th century, you know, and here, you know, here's me in the 21st century. Somehow carrying on their story.
Mm.
And then, if you like, I think particularly for me, my image was on the journey of leaving Skellig Michael behind. And for me, that was hugely symbolic of leaving my, if you like, my period of being a bishop and entering into retirement, into a different life. So in a way, that was a wonderful experience for me. In terms of the island of Ireland, there are many places where for instance, there are about 3,000 holy wells apparently throughout Ireland. There are many pilgrim sites. Many. One of the biggest is in terms of pilgrimages is the Clyne o Crowpatrick in July, which is a very arduous climb up, and some people do it in their in bare feet, and it's really quite sharp stones and so on. So it really is a kind of purgatory, really, in a sense, to do it. Certainly a very enacted penance, and that would be a big theme, I think, within the both within Celtic Christianity, but also in these pilgrimages. They can be really tough. And some people go up on their knees and so on, and it's a huge mountain, and of course, as good Protestants say, you don't need to do all that. Grace is free. And so on. So and so I feel, in a sense, there's a reality there that these traditions that are so prevalent in Ireland hold for me, that I have been, if you like, deflected away from, and never really been able to explore.
And interesting how you bring us right up to the present day with the current, the Protestant Catholic tensions that are still obviously present in these islands as a whole. And the physicality of the kind of the crawling or the walking barefoot is a very strong theme in the golden age of the Celtic period, when between the kind of 5th and the 8th centuries, when there was a real the genuflecting and the prostrating and the standing in cold water to pray was very much part of that legacy. Sarah, give us your context and make a wider introduction to yourself in relation to this notion of the thin places and the sense that an island such as Lindisfarne offers to the pilgrims that come.
Sure. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about thin places and my difficulty with that phrase, thin place. I'd rather talk about liminality, I think, or a place of transition, or a place of transformation, or the possibility of transformation. I absolutely get the thing about thin place between earth and heaven, but I would really hesitate, as you said, I think earlier, Ruth, that can only take place on islands or places at the edge of the land and the sea, or high up on a mountain or something. And it's been a bit taken up, I think, by some of those places and owned. So I'd like to widen out that thin place notion into talking more about liminality and what that transitional space means. And maybe that's partly because in my former life, before I was ordained, I was a psychiatrist, and dealt with people, tried to help people who were often in a transitional or liminal space in their life journey themselves. And I suppose in my thinking about liminality and embodiment is the other thing. I think, Trevor's just been talking about walking up with bare feet or on one's knees. And I think there's something really, really important about thinking about embodiment and liminality in the same sentence, if you like. So I'm South African originally. My parents were involved in anti-apartheid activities and left South Africa, and we moved to the north of the island of Ireland in 1971, although in those days, in my circles anyway, nobody called it the island of Ireland. It was Northern Ireland. And I went to a school which was unusually in those days Protestant and Catholic, Dalriada, in the country of Dalriada, where Columba came from, you know, in the nation of Dalriada, I suppose. And I think growing up as I did there near Ballymoney in the 1970s and early 80s, and then going to England, which was a far off place from then, even though I'd had the background from South Africa as well, going to England to the very sort of agitated city of Sheffield in 1984, in the middle of the miners' strikes. And again, another liminal space for many people then, when the coal mines were being closed. Being a steel worker was really difficult. Being a miner was really, the whole life was under threat. So that, again, the embodiment and the liminality of those transitions. I then, I think partly because all of that felt that reconciliation was already in my bones, or conflict and reconciliation, having lived in those places of conflict in the land. Studied a theology of reconciliation, and then ended up at Coventry Cathedral as their canon for reconciliation. Maybe for that's where I ended up before I came here to this other liminal space. And I would say that Coventry Cathedral itself, if people have been there or know it, there's a huge liminality between the ruins of the old cathedral, which was destroyed in 1940, gosh, I had that off pat one day, but once, 1940. And then the liminality of the walk and the embodiment of walking from those ruins into the new cathedral, a sign of hope, and from the destruction and the suffering. And again, here I'm living on an island, which is half an island. We're not always an island. You know, the tide comes in and out and covers up the causeway. So when the tide is out, you can drive or walk across the Pilgrim Poles or the tarmacked road. And at other times we are a real island. And here we have the liminality of the ruins of the priory and the intact older, in fact, church of St. Mary. So again, there's liminality and embodiment in I think it's really important for all of us that wherever we find ourselves, those notions, those themes can come together. And I would hate them to be sort of just people to think you have to go to an island to find a thin place.
Thank you. And I think we've opened up that question. I would love to hear after the breakout rooms, all of your reflections on what does a thin place mean to you, or a liminal space, as Sarah has said. I'm going to take us on to a theme which, Sarah, you've now opened up for us, the theme of reconciliation. So it's the third of our three questions. I'll come back to the second one in a minute, but I wanted to jump to the third because there's a real connection here with what you've just been talking about. And I guess the thing to say is that the three of us met, having known each other in different contexts. We three met through a project called Spirituality of Conflict, which was a writing project initiated by Padraig Ó Tuama and others through the Corrymeela community. And then when you broadened that out and invited others of us in to be part of the writing group, to write reflections on the gospel through the lens of conflict. And I think in those conversations, which I would say were liminal spaces themselves, where we divested of ourselves, we shared openly of ourselves and our own experiences of conflict, and then looked at those through the lens of the gospel. But those were all around, where is there potential for reconciliation? And I said at the beginning that this series was inspired by an invitation to Australia and then on to New Zealand. And a question that has arisen for me is about reconciliation between peoples and the land and the history of the land on which they sit. So later this year, there's going to be a crucial vote in Australia, which will, if passed, recognise the first peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice in the Australian Parliament. So there is a long and complex history shared between the first peoples around the globe in Australia, New Zealand, and in Canada and the United States, between the First Nations of the first peoples of those nations and the peoples of what we call the Celtic lands. So my question is, what would your hope be for the reconciliation of relationships around the globe in relation to land that was conquered, that was colonized? These are powerful words. How do we move forward as a whole human race in relation to the notion of indigeneity and land? And Sarah, I wonder if I can throw that massive question back to you. Just a brief word, and then we'll hear from Trevor. Yeah.
This question, I think, is massive, as you've just said, Ruth. I think I'd like to take us to Rumi, to the 13th century Persian poet. And Rumi said, or wrote, "Out there, beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. Out there, beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there." And I think that is really core to this issue of land, and whose land is it? Who has been fighting over this land? How far do we go back to? You know, I know a bit about the Canadian struggle with reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and the land issue there, but also the residential schools, the dreadful things that happen in residential schools in Canada. And I know more about the land issue in South Africa, which again, post-apartheid, recommendations were made to restitute land, among other things, back to First Nations peoples in South Africa. But then you have it's really tricky, you know, who are the First Nations peoples? Who are the Indigenous peoples? And on this island, we have islanders, and islanders are people who have lived here for generations. Their families have been here for generations. And then we have residents, people who might have been born here but are not of island families, so they can't be islanders. And then you have second home owners, and then you have tourists and pilgrims and everything else. I think my hope for reconciliation in terms of land and indigeneity, we in the global north, or in the, however we want to say it, but we need to do much better than we have been doing. I think it's a really serious question, because as we look into through the lens and forward into climate, the climate crisis, then land is going to become more and more and more important. Yeah. And who owns and who is on the land and what is done with that land is vital. So that's not an answer, but my hope is that we take it more seriously than we have done, and put the really tricky stuff on the table.
Yeah. Yeah. As you would in any conflicted situation, you'd be walking towards the conflict, putting the tricky stuff on the table. Trevor, what would your response be to that question about reconciliation and your hope for reconciliation?
Yeah, well, obviously the land has been a huge issue, and I suppose symbol, and ownership of land has been a huge symbol of power in Ireland. And for instance, in the 1780s, just 5,000 landlords controlled 95% of the productive land in Ireland. So there's a tiny minority of people who actually had the control, if you like, of the rest, through their ownership of land. And in the 1900s, the majority of the land, 97%, was tenanted. In other words, the best that people could do was rent their place on the land on the island of Ireland. And as we know, obviously, one of the legacies that we face in Northern Ireland is due to plantations from Scotland and from England and so on in the 16th and 17th centuries and so on. So land, if you like, and your own identity in Ireland has been a huge issue. And on the one hand, if you like, of those who landowners, there's the fear of losing the land, and of those who, if you like, are deprived of ownership of land, their rage against the injustice that they have been served, they feel, they are some of the, if you like, living tensions that actually still emerge in our politics today. So this is a very pertinent question. And who are the indigenous? Certainly, if you like, the Irish would say they are, but actually, the Protestants would claim that their right to be here is a part of the job that they have been doing, if you like, for the British establishment, and therefore they have a right. So it's the competing rights and competing ownership of land is very heart of the whole thing. Just to just put another sort of side flash into this, I can't help thinking about this whole question of land in the past, as we've been talking about, which is actually for rural areas still a big issue in Ireland. But actually, perhaps even for a more widespread reality, home ownership, if you like, and homelessness is a kind of modern version of this, and the inability to actually find a place that actually provides security, that provides sustenance, that provides the basic necessities. So this is not that when we're talking about land and whose rights it's a very contemporary question as well, in terms of the experience people are living through, particularly in the present crisis. In terms, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Trevor. Shall I go ahead? That's right. Yeah. And take my collar off because I'm getting hot. So excuse me.
Must be a sermon in that, Sarah.
There must be, yeah. But anyway, I was also going to say about the sea. We're talking about land, but actually who owns the sea is really pertinent. And on this island and on the west coast of Scotland, currently, it's really pertinent issue. We have just been through on this island a fishing crisis and a fishing campaign. DEFRA wanted to make this a highly protected marine area, which in terms of rewilding the sea. Now that rewilding the sea is a really good thing. I should say at the start of what I'm about to say, but again, who makes the decisions about the sea in this Celtic sea, if you like? As Ruth said before, the communications for the ancient northern or Celtic saints was the sea, partly because it was easier, but partly also because the land was difficult to navigate with forests and wild beasts and stuff. So our sea was nearly taken away from us, or our right to fish in the sea was nearly taken away from us this year, and it was a huge campaign that we mounted and thankfully won. But since then, I've been contacted by fishing people in Tiree who are now facing the same problem that the Scottish government now wants to designate 10% of the Scottish Sea as highly protected marine areas. 10% of the sea. How was that decision made, and how do we, as Indigenous peoples, how can we fight those decisions well and sensibly and rationally in the way that I like to think, well, more than I like to think, I know from reading Bede and other people that Aidan and Cuthbert fought decisions about all sorts of things that they were faced with then.
And I think, you know,
but they matter today. Those things matter to us.
Yeah, and these are the controversial issues around the politics of land and sea that there are no swift and easy answers, because there are so many competing needs and desires and rights to be contained and contested. I think back to the indigeneity question, I wanted just to offer a reflection that I was offered in a seminar that Deanne Speed, who's here in the call, hosted from Australia through the Wellspring community last year, or it might have been earlier this year, Deanne, I forget. But there was a question put to those of us who will be travelling to Australia in the later half of this year. In our preparations, the invitation was, come knowing about your own hinterland. And in terms of the reconciliation hope around land use and indigeneity, that was a really powerful invitation to me, so that I no longer take for granted the Orcadian roots that are part of my family heritage, or the fact that on both sides of my family there were missionaries in India and engineer missionaries in Australia, and the consequences of their behaviours have effects for all of us, not just for those in the other continents described, but for those of us also in this country. But the invitation to consider our own hinterland, each of us, and the complexity that each of our lives, here represented by faces on screens, each of our lives represent, and all the controversies and the histories bound up in our stories, that invitation is the one that I hope would be the beginnings of some of the reconciliation work that is carried out in such agencies like Truth and Reconciliation Commissions and so on, so that we can talk about the tough stuff, putting the tough stuff back on the table, as you said, Sarah, earlier. I want to just wrap up our input by just going back to this politics question and asking us each just to say a couple more words about the politics of land. We've begun talking about it already. For example, many of you will know about the buyout of the island of Egg by the people of Egg, an island further north from Iona. And this was 25 years ago now. They celebrated their anniversary not long ago, when they raised the money and the community spirit to buy out the island on behalf of the people of the island of Egg. And I read just today a tweet by Alistair McIntosh that a similar progress has been made around the township of Tavialach in Argyll. Margaret, who's here on the call, you might know a bit more about this, but they were recently awarded £500,000 by the Scotland Land Trust in order to secure land they've already been gifted and to buy more land. Now, you know, this is a great thing. It's the people of the land being given power and responsibility and creative energy to care for the diversity, the biodiversity on the land, to sequester the carbon, to do all kinds of things and projects that they are keen to do. But it's still bound up in ownership and in money and who owns land. And I guess I'm just left with, well, on the one hand, rejoicing, on the other hand, thinking we're still bartering for land. And will this be how it always will be in terms of ownership? And I've not forgotten, Trevor, your powerful input about that this is on a spectrum with homelessness today, and who gets to own a bit of property. And this will be really brief, just a couple of sentences from each of us before we then let people go back into the breakout rooms. Trevor, do you want to just pick up the politics of land and add a couple more thoughts to that?
Well, I think as we've been saying here, addressing some of these questions is really central to any hopeful reconciliation in Ireland, certainly. And it's interesting that the government in the Republic of Ireland has actually now called a whole program, a funding program, where they're promoting a whole series of initiatives under the title of a shared not Ireland, a shared island. And it's an interesting thing. They've if you like, tried to help people rise above the political divisions and say we naturally belong together here on this island in whatever political arrangement we want to. But let's talk about what it might be and different models that might be possible in terms of sharing this island together. For me, that's a very hopeful and very productive possibility. And it is bearing some fruit.
Wow.
I have to say that some unionists are very scared of anything that actually is inclusive of the whole island, because they feel that diminishes their right, if you like, to be Northern Ireland and linked to Britain, which is their identity. So unfortunately, the conversation isn't as widespread and as accepted as it could be. But I think the initiative is certainly to be very welcome. Yeah.
Well, and it's not a big leap at all to think of Israel-Palestine and the settlements and the horrendous persecution of the Palestinian people by some policies that are fairly awful. So immediately we get into looking at other parts of the world where populations are being squeezed out of land all over the place and historically. Sarah, any further words about the politics of land before we move into breakout groups?
I was just listening to Trevor, thinking, so here in North Northumberland, not talking specifically about this holy island, but the land on the mainland across from us, there are some very big landowners, and they're with very big houses and with farm workers' cottages associated with them. And driving through Northumberland, and I'm sure many people here have seen this, maybe in other places as well, but if the big house has red drain pipes and a red door, then all the farm workers' cottages also have to have red drain pipes and a red door. And that's about ownership. That's to say, it's not just about it matching. It's about saying those cottages, and maybe therefore even today those people belong to us in the big house. And I personally, just very quickly, it's a very conflicting place to be, because I'm a white South African. What does that mean? It means all sorts of things to all sorts of people, but it's complicated. My father's family was one of those very tiny percentage of people in the island of Ireland who owned a big house, and in the 1800s, and owned thousands of hectares of land. That's really complex for me, working in this field of reconciliation and trying to own my white privilege, but also my Irish colonial history and all of these other things. And it's sometimes I think, should I be speaking at all? Should I be leaving it to others? And then I think, Ruth said just now about the island of Egg and where people have been given the means to be empowered and stuff. And so we're still talking, and I'm not, that is just how it is. Being given the means to empower, well, shouldn't they be able to empower themselves without being given it by others, or by funding, or by something? And we're trying to do that here on the island at the moment, actually, is to doing a big community engagement community project from the church, with the Development Trust and others, to build some more social housing, some more affordable homes on the island. And we're trying really hard to do that from a, if you like, a liberation theology or a bottom-up approach, so that people can empower themselves. But it's a long, tricky process. And again, where do we as individuals fit with all of that?
Absolutely. And I think, there's a question to end with. Where do we as angels fit individuals fit with all of that? And what are our responses? What are our thoughts? What are our reflections on all that we've heard? I mean, we've opened up a whole range of fairly wide issues, from thin places to politics to indigeneity to liminality to sea and land. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Trevor. Folks, we're going to put you into breakout rooms for about 20 minutes now. And then when we come back, we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for a few questions and a rounding up conversation altogether. So I'm going to look at Rolf. Are we ready to go into breakout rooms, Rolf? Just give Rolf 1 minute. And here's the question that you've got in your breakout room. You can discuss whatever you like. Please make sure you introduce yourselves to one another. But in the breakout rooms, you might want to consider, what is the one thing that has struck you from the conversation this evening? So there's a focus. If there's just one thing that has struck you, what might that be? Welcome back, one and all. Thank you very much for taking the time to join those groups. Without any further ado, we'd like just to open the floor for these last 15 minutes or so, a bit less than 15 minutes. And we're aware that we're amongst experts in the field of Christian spirituality, Celtic spirituality, and the connections with land. So please, we'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to make a contribution, it can be a question, but we'd love to hear your comments, your thoughts on anything that was shared or any thoughts from your conversation. Then please just raise your hand or call out, unmute yourself and say hello, and we'll bring you to the front. And Fiona, if we can bring Trevor and Sarah and myself back to the front. I've seen Margaret's hand, Margaret Jacobson, if you can join us with Sarah and myself and Trevor.
Yeah, it's, well, first I'd like to say thank you to all three of you. I've been scribbling away furiously, and it's been really good. Some of the things that particularly Sarah was saying, because I share your experience and knowledge of the mining industry in the 80s. I lived and worked in Sheffield and was a member of the Women Against Pit Closures. I also worked for the police authority, which made it slightly difficult. But my concern is, in all that I hear about the land, and I don't hear any real care for the population, because we're constantly being wiped off the land, which certainly in Scotland we've considerable experience of that, as of so many other countries. Just been hearing from Vicky talking about the same thing in Nova Scotia. And I just wonder where there is in the land. And certainly here in Argyll at the minute, we have a major thing going on, as you were talking about, Sarah, in terms of the highly protected areas, because we're about to wipe out our fishing industry. Now, we shouldn't be wiping out our fishing industry. We should be wiping out the German trawlers and all the other foreigners that fish our waters. And we should be encouraging people to do inland fishing and drop the dredging and drop the massive factory things. So my concerns, Ruth, are all about people. How do we manage and hold the population? Because it's there that people... I left Glasgow when I was 20, and I've wandered all over England, and I've lived in France. And what brought me back was because my roots are here in Scotland. Mm-hmm. I resonate with Scotland.
Sure. I mean, I think, well, let's keep you here, Margaret, and let's just throw the floor open. Is there anyone else that wants to add before we ask for any further contributions from Sarah and Trevor? Anybody else from the wider group that wants to add to that question about land and the people particularly? Just unmute yourselves and say, yes, please, I'd like to say something. Is that where you're? There we are. David, yes. Go for it. Share your thoughts.
Well, just been writing in the chat and thought that it would be easier to do it speaking. Just as this discussion and sharing has gone on, the question about deciding who are the indigenous, that in some places that's very clear. The Aboriginal people in Australia, for example, and places where that's no question. But take Ireland, for example, or these islands in the Celtic wave coming from far not far east, but well east and then embedded in Europe. They moved across, and in Ireland, they shoved out the people that were here.
Mm. Yeah.
So we just sense that there's nothing is simple.
Nothing is simple, exactly.
And you can think you can be restoring, but there's some places that people are gone altogether, like in the Caribbean. The Caribs are no longer to be found at all. You know, in Ireland, some people are shown that there's a blood link with the earlier peoples. It's just a thought as part of it.
And David, I think, you know, what you're pointing to is what Trevor pointed us to earlier and what Margaret's now brought to us, that wherever, you know, we can debate land and indigeneity, and there are some very important reparations to be made around the world in terms of land grabbing, for sure, and still ongoing, as we've said, about places like the Middle East. However, people of goodwill around the world and people inspired by the Christian gospel need to hold all with power to account. And that's in relation to how we use our land and our seas and how we treat the creatures of the earth, including the humans. I don't know, Margaret, if you want to respond to David before we go back to Trevor or to Sarah.
I recognise the difficulty of sort of working out who the Indigenous folk are. And I suppose you can't just keep going back for generation after generation, but what you can do is actually begin to recognise it as something that's important, and we don't value it. And I think we don't value it because we can't count it, we can't measure it, we can't put a price on it. And we need to move away from having to be able to price absolutely everything.
We've consumerized our indigeneity as well, haven't we? We've monetized it.
That's
Sarah, yeah. Any thoughts, Sarah, about the question of the place of people?
I think what Margaret said about the fishing and Argyll and Tiree and things that, as I mentioned as well, you know, it's not only, I think it's a really good example of what we're talking about, because the fisherman from Tiree who spoke to me a few weeks ago said, if this goes ahead in those islands in Scotland, the language will almost certainly disappear as well, because those fishing communities that will die, and the Gaelic language will probably die out too, or there's a good chance it will. That's what he was saying. So it's all bound up together, isn't it? And I think you're right. It's how we think about the peoples on the land as well.
And Trevor, any thoughts before we move on?
Yes, I suppose, thank you very much indeed for those responses as well, because I think, as Margaret so clearly put it, what about the people? And after all, we are basically talking about relationships and the quality of our relationships together. And our relationship with the earth is that we must respect the earth, because that is so much, well, that's the ground of our life, if you like. It gives us sustenance. It gives us hope. We are we are totally bound to the earth and its resources. It is part of us. It is part of life. But we're also bound to each other. And one of our problems always has been that we have always seen resources as in terms of scarcity, and therefore to be powerful, people land grabbed, resource grabbed, and so on, in order to secure their future, but also to secure their advancement, rather than seeing that our real advancement is when in understanding the question is that my life can't be fulfilled unless my neighbor's life is also fulfilled, and that's my world neighbor as well. So in a sense, it's interesting where are the liminal spaces for me. I suppose I have been terribly fortunate to have a long-term experience of being a member of the Corrymeela community. And that is, if you like, my liminal space. That is where I have discovered a wider version of the world than I knew. it's met people that I wouldn't normally socially have come into contact with. It has been the place of transformation for me in terms of my own healing and healing journey, I suppose I should say. So in a way, that's where a lot of those Celtic themes come to reality for me in my experience.
Thank you, Trevor. And I mean, I suppose the question for all of us is, where is our thin place? Where's our liminal space? Corrymeela, Iona, other communities, urban centres. I asked that question once of a friend, and he said it's the bus stop where I stand every morning and watch the same people walk past day after day after day. And I pray for them as they pass, and that's my liminal space. Yeah. And of course, as we think of the people, a big question in the Iona community is about our care for creation. How do we wrestle with the politics of the sea and the harvesting of the sea, while also honouring all the creatures, not stewarding, but honouring, respecting, co-inhabiting the earth and the seas? Margaret, David, thank you so much. There's time for one more person if you'd like to. I'm going to send you back to your seats metaphorically, so we'll unspotlight you and let you return to your seats. Is there anybody else who'd like to share something from your discussion or your thoughts before we bring this to a close? Just unmute yourself and come forward. I don't know, Miriam, do you want to come and share what you've put in the chat? It'd be good to have you in here. So Miriam said, private necessity and public abundance, the concept from donut economics, really helpful in terms of the resources of conflict, which will increase as the climate crisis worsens. Let's just bring Miriam forward.
Absolutely.
You can't see me, so there's no need to.
Okay, well, Miriam,
I don't have good connection, so it won't mean anything. Well, but yeah, I just think that's really helpful concept. In our community, we're trying to get a car share together. And so that idea of, how do we start to share more, given that we know that there's going to be more and more challenge with resources. And I think that's the challenge, isn't it? How do we do that, and how do we do it well? Yeah. And public things are always challenging because you have to get on with each other, which is always challenging. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try and do it.
Sure. Thank you, Miriam. And I think that's a very helpful segue into a final comment. Then I'm going to invite Sarah and then Trevor to offer a final comment, and then I'd like to come back and end with a reflection myself on what Miriam shared before we finally close. Sarah, I'm going to turn to you first for your final thoughts, and then to Trevor.
Thank you, Ruth. My final thought, I'd like to use the words of, go to the words of Katrina Porteous, who's a Northumberland poet. A wonderful person, and she's written a really beautiful and very long poem about crossing the sands to Holy Island and what refuge means. And I'm just going to read a very, very tiny piece of it, if I may, because she just puts what we've been talking about in so beautifully, I think. I am in flight from the spin, from the things that I know that I do not know, from the crush, from the crowds, from the push, from the shove, from the street, from the ice age, from the heat wave, from the fluttering heartbeat at the core of it all, from the unseen hole in the ozone's eye, from the fossil fuel in the soot-black, oil-rich mouth of the melting pot, from the permafrost, from the drip, drip, drip of its shrinking ice, from the jumbo jet, from the stink, from the smoke, from the smog, from the slick of the gridlocked highway's car exhaust, from the desert's breath, the glacier's roar, from the sun's frank stare, from the climate police, from the blazing forest glimpsed from space, from the rising tide, from the sea at our feet, at our children's feet. Send us an airlift, a lifeboat, an ark, or at least a refuge box.
What a beautiful reference to the refuges as you cross the pilgrim path. Such a rich melding of images, Sarah. Can you just remind us of the name of the poet?
Katrina Porteous, Porteous. It's from a book called Two Countries, and I really, really recommend her poetry, and it's a lot of it's about liminality and the shifting provisional relations between us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Beautiful. Trevor, a final word from yourself.
Sure. Well, I'd like to. Pádraig Tuma was a member of the group that both Sarah and Ruth and I were part of, and he's a lovely poem on relationships, which I think has been a thing we've if you like has emerged also along with liminality in our thing, and I just would like to read a poem from him which reflects his experience of Northern Ireland and relationships, and it's called Shaking Hands. And here it is. Because what's the alternative? Because of courage, because of loved ones lost, because no more, because it's a small thing, shaking hands. It happens every day. Because I heard of one man whose hands haven't stopped shaking since a market day in Iona. Because it takes a second to say hate, but it takes longer, much longer, to be a great leader. Much, much longer. Because shared space without human touching doesn't amount to much. Because it's easier to speak to your own than to hold the hand of someone whose side has been previously described, proscribed, denied. Because it is tough. Because it is tough. Because it is meant to be tough. And this is the stuff of memory, the stuff of hope, the stuff of gesture and meaning and leading. Because it has taken so long. Because it has taken land and money and languages and barrels of blood. Because lives have been lost, because lives have been taken. Because to be bereaved is to be troubled by grief. Because more than 2 troubled peoples live here. Because I know a woman whose hand hasn't been shaken since she was a man. Because shaking a hand is only a part of the start. Because I know a woman whose touch calmed a man whose heart was breaking. Because privilege is not to be taken lightly. Because this just might be good. Because who said that this would be easy? Because some people love what you stand for, and for some, if you can, they can. Because solidarity means a common hand. Because a hand is only a hand. So hang on to it. So join your much discussed hands. We need this for one small second. So touch, so lead.
That's such a beautiful poem, Trevor. Thank you. What a wonderful way to end. I don't want to take away from that tender ending. I would like just to say thank you to each of you on the screen here. Vicky, thank you for your thoughts about two-eyed seeing, which I noticed in the chat, a lovely little link for those of us to take forward in terms of Indigenous, non-Indigenous conversations. Miriam, thank you for your thoughts on private necessity, public abundance. One of our rules of life within the Iona community is to account with one another for the way we use our time, our money, and the earth's resources. And I feel that for me, the takeaway tonight will be to go back to that part of our rule of life and to, in my small family group, to ask the question, how do I account for the way that land is used or abused in the conversations about resources? Thank you to Rolf and to Fiona for guiding us effortlessly through the technicalities. And thank you, dear Sarah and dear Trevor, for joining us from your beautiful islands on the screen. Friends, the next of these gatherings will be on the 12th of September when Ian Bradley, in a recorded conversation, but Ian will be joining us. He'll give us a 40-minute input on his book about the Celtic Way, or remembering, following the Celtic Way, and then he'll be here for a conversation about Celtic Christianity and what we believe. So for now, it remains for me just to say thank you once more to all of you here. in particular to Trevor and Sarah, and good night.
Good night.
Or good day, Deanne, in
Indeed.
Australia.